Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss how some senior Conservatives, Dominic Raab, the now disgraced Matt Hancock, and even Boris Johnson are starting to look much less assured in very different ways than they were just a month ago. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So when it comes to the question, get asked quite a bit, how do I stay sane enough to keep doing this each day? Well, I mean, looking ahead at realistic paths to a Conservative defeat in the next general election is definitely one of them. It's not always easy. I'd like to be in the position where a year and a half after the general election, which signalled the death knell of the more noble British values, we'd be looking at a resurgent opposition and collapsing Conservative government. But, I mean, it's not the current picture. But then it's also never been the current picture at this point. It's not how things go in politics. After a crushing general election defeat, you don't bounce back immediately. It's a bumpy road back. But there are signs to give me a bit of hope. Now, when a long-running government finally falls, it's not just that they lose a load of seats, dumping the rest of them on the opposition benches. Of course, that is what happens. But inevitably, some of those seats will belong to some of their heavyweights. So the overall leadership of the party has to readjust. Last week, Labour won Batley and Spen, the by-election, and it was tight. Absolutely. But the consequence is huge. It also taught me a new term, Cowley's paradox, put forward by a Professor Cowley, that if Labour win by a small number of votes, it should be no more significant than if they lost by an equally small margin. But the difference is massive. Boris Johnson has now lost 2 by-elections on the bounce, and Labour have avoided another civil war. Now, most people from the Conservatives' point of view will look at that last one as, well, it was a Labour seat which Labour have held, and actually they've held it with a reduced majority. But people paying close attention to politics will know that if the same people who stood last week had stood in 2019 and no others, the Conservatives would have won that seat in the general election. But that's not where the losses lie. I talked a bit ago during the local elections about how, despite overall losses for Labour, they took a council seat right in the Tory heartlands. Now, I'm a Labour supporter, but right now the priority is Conservatives losing seats. I'll be happy with the Liberal Democrats or Greens taking a Conservative seat because it all works to the same top priority in the end. Now, there are some in Labour who are opposed to that. They don't see a Liberal Democrat win as any different to a Tory win. They think that Liberal Democrat success would just create another Lib Dem Tory coalition, like in 2010. They think that's what would come in 2024. Now, first of all, the current Conservatives are too extreme even for a right of centre Liberal Democrat leadership. So even Liberal Democrats who will still defend that coalition, what they've got now is too extreme. The second thing to bear in mind is that the Liberal Democrats were punished by their voters severely in 2015 for enabling David Cameron's agenda. They lost almost all their seats. Almost all of them. The idea that they would repeat that mistake with an even more extreme set of Conservative ministers is, I think, safe to dismiss. But which extreme Conservative ministers will be left? I said when Matt Hancock resigned that it was a typical political resignation. On the face of it, absolutely. His resignation letter expressed regret at the tarnishing of the government's image, but not an apology for wrongdoing. He was giving the impression that the reason he's resigning is because other people are making a fuss, not because of anything he's done wrong. And this sort of thing usually results in the loyal party minister falling on their side, their sword for the greater good, being ushered back into the cabinet after a discrete period of time, when the heat has died down. You've backed the party will back you. But it seems it might not be that straightforward for Hancock. Now, his behaviour hasn't gone down at all well amongst Conservatives. And here's also linking to that Batley and Spen by-election. Such a tight margin. One of the factors that inevitably will have helped there was the fact that Boris Johnson tried to defend Matt Hancock. Even if he hadn't, maybe just Hancock's behaviour in general. But in trying to keep him in post, Johnson turned his usual trick of getting Tory MPs to come out in public support of the beleaguered Health Secretary. But this time it didn't work. It worked for everyone else, including Dominic Cummings, claiming that he had to drive his family because he thought he might be blind. It worked then. It didn't work for Hancock. His MPs wanted none of it. Keeping Hancock on was seen as a huge electoral liability, so he went. And as for the heat dying down, there was talk of him potentially being deselected. Now, before his resignation, a local Conservative councillor publicly called upon the party to deselect Hancock if he didn't resign. I guess the fact that he did resign means that that threat has abated. And he's in a safe Tory seat. He's in a very safe Tory seat, hefty majority. But those large majorities have been recent. Before Brexit, the Conservatives won comfortably. It was still a safe seat, but only because the left-wing vote was split. A common occurrence around the country. But if the Conservatives in general start to fare less well, Labour agrees to at least a non-aggression pact with other parties as they did in 1997. And Matt Hancock's behaviour still has the power to disgust, when the general election comes round. Then a safe seat like this could easily look under siege. In a situation like that, where the race could be tight, that local party might decide that a tainted candidate is an unaffordable luxury. But there are bigger threats to some of his former cabinet colleagues as well. Dominic Raab, Foreign Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister. There was a council seat involved in a by-election last week. Behind the noise of Labour's win, on the same day, there were a couple of council by-elections. One of them was won by the Liberal Democrats, taking a Conservative seat, with a huge swing in the vote as well. Another case of what appeared to be people voting strategically for the most likely candidate to displace the Conservatives. Clear evidence of Labour voters voting Lib Dem to get rid of the Conservatives. Another example of how, although the Conservatives have made gains in the Labour heartlands of the north of England, they've taken their eye off their own. The blue wall is crumbling. And it's now not just one result or a couple of results. It's now several results. And this council was in Dominic Raab's constituency, showing that displeasure with what the Conservatives are doing is in evidence in his own backyard. Now, there was already some tactical voting going on in 2019 in terms of the Westminster seat that Raab won. And that meant that Raab only just held off the Liberal Democrats. He narrowly won. He could have lost. But if the extremism of Boris Johnson's government continues to turn off some traditionally Conservative voters, and his focus on the north at the perceived expense of the south turns off others, Raab could well find himself losing his seat in the next general election. And in many ways, when the seats of senior Conservatives are threatened, that has a greater impact on campaign strategy than if it's a backbencher with no great influence. The same might also be true of Boris Johnson himself. He won over 50% of the vote in his constituency in 2019. So no amount of tactical voting, no switching of votes would displace him. It would help. But if you can persuade previous non-voters to go out and vote, that will also help. Bear in mind, there isn't a majority in the country large enough to overcome the number of people who just don't vote, but could. And that's certainly not the case in his constituency. Bear in mind that many voters just don't go to the polls because they don't feel that their vote will make a difference. It seems like it's too much effort. If the race, however, is seen as tight, all of a sudden that calculation switches. All of a sudden there's a greater reward for you walking down the end of your street with a pencil. Actually, they could provide pencils there. The turnout can increase. You then add on to that any personal disapproval amongst Conservative voters for Boris Johnson and what he'll have done. Then he could be losing support at the same time as his main rival. And in that particular case, it would be a Labour candidate could be gaining it. A comfortable majority of 7,000 votes, that's what Boris Johnson had, that can suddenly turn into a narrow defeat. Or even a big defeat, because let's put this into context. The former Conservative MP for Chesham and Amersham gained a majority of 16,000 votes in 2019. 16,000 votes. That's a nice, comfortable majority for anyone. That was overturned a few weeks ago by the Liberal Democrats. And when I say overturned, I don't mean from a 16,000 vote majority to they lost it by a few votes. They lost it by 7,000 votes. The Conservatives are starting to lose. And we've also seen that huge swings are possible. So it's not even the case that the marginals are looking ropey. Some safe seats could be looking very, very vulnerable. We know that these swings have not been caused by circumstances that are of the moment. We know what are the reasons. It's Conservative policies that the leadership intends to carry on pursuing for the rest of this Parliament. We also know that Boris Johnson has lost his political touch, if indeed he ever had one. He should have known that Matt Hancock couldn't be saved. He should have known that he needed to resign, and actually to show strength it would be better if he sacked him. The reason Hancock was forced out was not because he clearly broke the rules. Plenty of ministers, including himself in the past, have done that without consequence. The reason he had to go is because Conservative MPs demanded that he go. That Johnson tried to stick by Hancock by publicly backing him and declaring the matter closed, when those around him would not accept that outcome, means one of two things. One, Boris Johnson is not sensitive to the way the political wind is blowing. Michael Heseltine once famously said of Boris Johnson that he is someone who looks to see which way the crowd is running, then dashes out in front and shouts, "Follow me." Now, if he's shifted from that position, which clearly worked for him, to one of actually not paying attention to which way the crowd is going, but he's pumped up his own ego to believe that he can actually lead people, but without the vaguest idea as to which way people will follow him, then the only reason for him being leader of the party evaporates. Boris Johnson is Prime Minister because Tory MPs thinks he wins votes. You're only as good as your last result. His last few results have been defeats. Nothing on a massive scale. Nothing that's going to get the ordinary public talking about the Conservatives losing their touch. But as every single one of these defeats can be put down to policies and practices that Boris Johnson intends to double down on, then it's obvious which way the trend is going to go. The second possibility is that Johnson is maintaining his position of splendid isolation, even with the loss of Dominic Cummings. With Dominic Cummings by his side, everything was centralised. They tried to keep everyone else at arm's length. But that should have ended when Cummings went. Did Boris Johnson not even know about the strength of feeling within the party? Because I don't understand. If he understood how strongly Conservative MPs were on this, did he really think he could face them down? Or did he just not know? And if he didn't know, that means he's not talking to his whips. The people who exist specifically as a go-between between the leadership and the backbenchers to enforce party discipline. If Johnson isn't even in touch with his own MPs on a matter like this, he presumably isn't on a whole range of issues. And Conservative MPs aren't going to keep backing a leader that cuts them out of all decision-making forever. And then there's the polls. Now, Labour have been ahead of the Conservatives over a spread of several months before the vaccine boost kicked in. They opened up a huge lead. I still say it shouldn't have reversed as quite as much as it did if they'd have just bashed Brexit a bit. But it is what it is. It's still too large now, but it has narrowed a lot. The issues that have caused those Conservative losses are there long term. This summer, we have rising COVID cases, which will surely accelerate once those final restrictions are removed. They're even now talking about not even wearing face masks. We have food shortages that are going to get worse. We have Labour finally starting to discuss firm policies, though still mumbling about Brexit. But at least it means they're going to start saying to the public, it's not just that the Conservatives are bad, here's your alternative. Here's our alternative, which can only be to the good. Now, nothing's certain right now in the chaos of British politics, but there's definitely exists the possibility for the Conservatives to be put under a lot of pressure this autumn. And a lot of pressure this autumn will make it more serious than the same pressure last winter, because it'll be another year closer to the general election. So yeah, definitely things to look forward to and keep me sane a while longer, I would say. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.